8:18 a.m. Tuesday. George McClintock eased the train into the Union Station yards at 6th and Ludlow Streets, with water spraying out from beneath it. There was a weird sensation to it all, with the tracks covered by a full 6 inches of water rushing from north to south. It was almost as if he were bringing a boat to dock. He'd had to cut his speed drastically when they neared Dayton. The crossings were choked with people fleeing in wagons and autos and on foot, and many of the streets already had several inches of water in them. Where the CH and D tracks paralleled the Mad River entering Dayton from the northeast, the track bed was high, and there was water on both sides of it, ugly yellowish water, flecked with dirty foam. Hundreds of people were on the track, and he had to slow down even more and blast his whistle constantly to make them step out of the way. In all their faces was reflected the same thing, a stunned disbelief, dissolving gradually to outright fear. Many shouted at him to go back. As they neared downtown, the debris-choked water bounced savagely across the tracks. McClintock knew it wouldn't take much of that to eat away the track bed and cause a derailment. He slowed even more, but didn't stop. The water was much too deep for him to attempt to pull into the siding leading to the CH and D freight yard at Webster Street between 2nd and 3rd. So he continued moving toward the Union Station yards, actually glad it was necessary, because this would take him that much nearer his home. He was deeply moved by the sight of the waters sweeping down toward him as he crossed St. Clair Street, Jefferson, Main, and even Ludlow Street, right in front of the station. Far up Ludlow toward First Street was an upside-down wagon bumped along absurdly, and he had a crazy impulse to laugh. Now, with his train stopped, he set the brakes and hit the steam release valve. The shriek of the liberated steam was, he thought morosely, like some anguished death cry from an injured beast. 3 tracks over, on the rails nearest the station platform, sat a 5-car passenger train. Smoke still belched from the stack of the engine, and the windows were lined with faces, some pale and frightened, but others merely interested or irritated over the delay. 3 blocks ahead was the steel trestle over the Great Miami River, but even from here McClintock could see it was no more than 2 rows of girders rising above the water. Already there was a large backup of debris lodged against the upstream side of it, and someone had run a string of loaded coal cars onto the span to help hold it against the frightful current. He felt sick at the sight of the water depth in that direction. His house, his family, was over that way, too, and it was quite low there. The water in Perry Street must be 4 or 5 feet deep already. McClintock climbed out of the cab and stepped down into water higher than his ankles. It was bitterly cold at first, but there were more important things to think about. He cupped his mouth with his hands and bellowed for the crew to get the boats out. A half-dozen roadmen sloshed over to them from the terminal. One was station master Darrell Deltz. Boats, McClintock? You've got boats here? Yes, sir, the engineer said. 10 of them. Took 'em on at Treebine Crossing. Good man! The city's going to need them badly. I'll appoint 10 men to start rescue operations with them. This water hasn't crested yet. The station master looked over the men crowding around. Make that 9, Mr. Deltz, McClintock said. I'm taking one over there. He pointed toward his home area. They'll need help over there. I'll take one too, Melford said. He didn't wait for an answer, but waded to the car with the boats and threw open the door. The others followed. Delt seemed somewhat annoyed that the leadership in this novel crisis had somehow slipped from his grasp. He reasserted his authority as Fruits and McClintock towed their boats toward Ludlow Street, the bottoms of the crafts clanging hollowly as they bumped against the rails, the oars rattling about noisily under the seats. "All right, men," Delt shouted. "I want 8 volunteers." He smiled smugly. McClintock was deeply concerned. The water that had lapped to just above his ankles when he stepped from his engine was mid-calf high when he left the tracks at the Ludlow Street crossing, and the current struggled to wrench the boat from his grasp. He was struck by the eeriness of the silence, unbroken by the normal clopping of hooves, tooting of horns, and chattering of pedestrians. There was an ominous feel to it all, which filled him with a sense of foreboding. With the wide expanse of Ludlow Street open before him now, McClintock stepped into his boat and fitted the oars to the locks for a long moment before getting the boat under control. He was swept sideways with the current at an alarming rate. By the time he had the bow turned into the current and had slowed his backward speed with the oars, he had passed the corner of Eckert Street, a full block south of the station. To avoid any possible obstructions near buildings and several parked automobiles, one of which, as he passed it, turned end for end by the force of the current and began to roll backwards, he stayed in the center of the open area, which had been Ludlow Street. It was nearly a serious mistake. The Franklin Street intersection where he had to turn was approached rapidly. The street sign, sticking up oddly from the water, at this intersection the current split, half of it roaring in a vicious curve to go west on Franklin, and the other half continuing southward on Ludlow toward the canal. A treacherous eddy was forming at the angle of the sturdy brick building on the near corner. Almost too late, McClintock started his turn, and his forward speed was so great that the curve of the current could scarcely overcome the inertia he had built up. Swiftly he sped across the mouth of Franklin Street and slammed with crushing impact into the side of a frame store on the southwest corner. Had the boat been wooden, it might well have been smashed. As it was, the rear of the craft hit the house, bending the metal considerably and catapulting the engineer into the air. He hit the side of the house and then miraculously bounced right back into the boat, shaken but unhurt. It had taught him a good lesson in the art of metropolitan navigation. He bent to the oars and now kept the boat just a few feet streetward from where the curb had to be. For the first time, he became aware of the voices. Every second story window, it seemed, had at least one person, and often 2 or 3 in it. They shouted at him, screamed for help, beseeched, implored, offered him great sums, and then cursed him as the current shot him past. At Perry Street, he let the turn of the current carry him neatly around the corner to the south, guiding himself expertly so that the boat neared the west side of the street as it straightened out again. He felt a surge of exultation at the way he'd handled it this time. Here on Perry, the current was not as swift as it had been on Ludlow, but the water was deeper, perhaps 5 feet. The white picket fence in front of his house at 219 Perry was gone. Needed painting anyway, he told himself with a sort of grim humor. But he felt a relaxation of his muscles as well as his fears to see the big old house still standing, even though the water had only one more step to go before it would be level with the front porch. He steered the boat to a neat landing between the banisters of the wide front porch stairs, and let the current pin the boat to the south railing. Holding it tightly, he moved the bow and stepped out onto the dry porch, and then pulled the boat after him, clear of the water. Daddy! Daddy! The front door burst open, and 12-year-old Ruthie raced out and flung herself into his arms. I told you he'd come. I knew you would. Grandma said you wouldn't be able to get through, but I knew you'd come home. She kissed him fiercely. Hi, Angel, he said, grinning. You were right, weren't you? Takes more than just a little bit of water to keep me away from my favorite girl. George! The woman's voice came from the doorway. Oh, Georgie, thank God. I thought I. McClintock's plump elderly mother bit her lip, and he stepped quickly to the door and put an arm around her shoulders. He kissed her on the forehead. Hello, Mom, he said gently. I'm glad you're safe. He looked around worriedly. Where's Robert? He's all right, George. He went to Carrie's house yesterday afternoon to spend the night. She called this morning when all this started, and I told her to keep him there, where it'd be safer. I'm so glad I did. I never realized the water would get this high. What are we going to do, George? McClintock was much relieved to hear his sister was keeping his 14-year-old son there. She and her husband and their 2 sons lived in Upper Riverdale, on ground so high that the whole of Dayton would have to be flooded before the water even reached them. At the rate that this water was going up, though, even they might have trouble. Listen now, he said, we're going to have to work fast. Ruthie, you help Grandma and start carrying everything you can possibly manage upstairs, starting with all the food we have. Is the water still running? His mother shook her head. Not now. But I thought of that, George. I filled several pans, the old bucket and some jugs, just before it stopped. Good girl. Get them upstairs first thing, too. I'll tie up the boat and then help get the heavier things up. They worked fast. But before long, the water began pouring in at both front and back door sills. The house creaked frighteningly, and the water gurgled with a menacing hunger. Nonetheless, nearly everything that the 3 of them could manage had been taken upstairs by the time the water was a foot deep in the living room. McClintock hurriedly ate a sandwich and drank a glass of milk while telling his mother he was going to try to help some of the neighbors now that things were pretty well set here. There was anxiety in the older woman's eyes, but she didn't try to dissuade him, asking only that he be very careful. She followed him down the stairs as far as the water, and then took his face between her hands and kissed him. It really is just like your dream, isn't it, Georgie? He nodded, startled. He wished she hadn't remembered. He was doubly glad now he hadn't told her all of it. The dream he'd had on Friday night had awakened him with a cry of horror that had brought his mother running. But in the bright sunshine of Saturday, they'd both been able to laugh about it, and it seemed absurd in the dream. In the dream, he told her, he had watched as Dayton was smashed by a devastating flood of water more than 30 feet deep. People had drowned by the thousands, and when a fire started downtown, it had raged unhampered, and nearly the whole city had burned. But the horror of the dream, the sight that had awakened him with such a start, was when he recognized one of the floating bodies as his own. That was the part of the dream he hadn't told his mother. You stay upstairs with Ruthie now, Mom, he cautioned her. And don't worry about me. I'm a good swimmer, and I'll be plenty careful.